Welcome to this Q&A for April 2022. We have lots of questions on the most topical issues, plus the usual left field ones just to keep us on our toes. So let's dive straight in. I had two questions from patron supporters with a strong overlap, so this is clearly on people's minds right now. Gary asked a long question, the essence of which was, if Putin is losing, or at least failing to win, might he not decide to hit the nuclear button to take everyone else out with him? And that overlaps with this question with the slightly more restrained scenario. In the event that Russia uses a tactical battlefield nuke in an effort to bring a resolution to their efforts in Ukraine, what is the scope of likely responses from the Western powers? Do we have a playbook for this eventuality, and might this tip the conflict into a new phase where NATO forces would directly engage with Russian forces in Ukraine? There is no way of answering either of those questions that isn't an attempted mind read of key decision makers. Now, the most likely use by Russia of nuclear weapons would be battlefield nukes, the sort of bombs that would take out football field-sized chunks out of whatever they land on, but which would also create radiation pollution, of course. If Russia uses one or two of those simply to make a point, there will be massive condemnation, howls of protest, probably not more. At that point, it's as bad as using chemical weapons or other banned munitions, obviously slightly worse, but not sufficiently so that I think the alliance would conclude that its best option is to provoke more and worse. The line gets crossed if they were to drop a tactical nuclear bomb on top of Kyiv on a size that would wipe the city out. At that point, you have moved to full-on nuclear war. The question of whether it can be contained from that point is a very difficult one, because Russia will be on a hair trigger, knowing that it may have provoked a massive response. NATO will be on a hair trigger, knowing that a first strike against it might imminently follow. Seriously, we aim to avoid such a situation. The former scenario strikes me as possible. The good news is I think the latter scenario is highly unlikely. Moscow's few important allies, notably China, will be extremely keen for the world to avoid all-out nuclear conflagration, and it's hard to see any scenario where Russia would expect to come out with an advantage worth having from that point. What about the other scenario, that Putin thinks it's all lost and decides après moi le déluge, except in Russian? That becomes a possibility if he believes that the integrity of the Russian state is imminently about to fall. Does he associate himself so strongly with the state that he could mistake the two? Well, yeah, maybe. If he were in danger of being deposed, would the Russian machine cooperate with a suicidal urge with an all-out nuclear strike? Again, being asked to mind read people who we don't know, who almost certainly think in very different ways and see the world in very different ways to us. It's possible. But given the universal instinct amongst humans for self-survival, you shouldn't imagine there are no barriers to that happening. The thing is that so long as you have weapons of mass destruction, you can't rule out their use, even to the degree of catastrophic error of judgment. The invasion of Ukraine itself was an example of such an error of judgment, so while I think it would be highly unlikely, you can't rule it out. The open question is this: would the West, knowing the human extinction potential of a full exchange, would it respond to a partial nuclear strike with a full-on retaliation? Supposing Moscow didn't blow up Kyiv, but blew up London or Paris. How much bluff holds up the Western nuclear deterrent, and how much resolve? Would the leaders who urged Zelensky to flee for his life commit mass suicide on behalf of the human race because one major city, however important, was destroyed? We have no idea. Let's hope we never find out. What do you make of commentary suggesting that Sweden and Finland may join NATO and that Russia would be outraged at such a thing? It seems reasonably likely, and it shouldn't be a surprise because actions have consequences. The fact that Finland, which has a large shared border with Russia and has been neutral for so long, should feel so threatened as to be prepared making a provocation of that sort tells you a lot about how much everything we thought we knew about world politics has just changed. Old certainties have been destroyed. People are suddenly grappling with the idea we are back in a world where might means right. Fortunately, Russia's threatened response, that it would cite nuclear weapons in the Baltics, seems a rather weak response because Western intelligence suggests that they've had nukes sighted there for years already. I think that reflects a lack of interest in Moscow in actually making a move on Scandinavia. If it was looking to add territory, that's not the direction it would be focused in the short term. But who knows? Highly changeable times can lurch in directions you didn't expect. Hi Mallen, I've heard people say that the Ukraine war will speed up the transition to non-fossil fuel energy. And I've heard other people say the opposite, that it will slow it down. What's your view? I'm not going to make a prediction on such things to be held to because there are so many variables in play. I don't have a strong view on how it's going to play out. My gut instinct, for what it's worth, is that it will make very little difference. Two of the top three emitters are China and India. Their timetable to move away from fossil fuels is unlikely to be affected by the war in Ukraine, and they will be big coal burners in the short term, regardless. The country that sits between them in the top rankings is the United States, and any really radical action there would have to have legislative support that Biden doesn't have. Fourth in the list is Russia, which will find buyers for its oil and gas regardless of whether they're in Europe or not, and will not be in a hurry to make any sort of switch. Significantly less than China, in fact. China's geography and population distribution makes it quite vulnerable to some aspects of climate change, hence why its leadership does in fact take the issue seriously, in spite of its short-term priorities. Russia doesn't expect to suffer from the next few decades of global warming, and its leadership will be attracted to discomforting the West by ignoring one of its stated priorities, which the West doesn't have the power to enforce upon it. Then you get down to relatively small shares of the global whole, so if some countries move a bit faster than they otherwise would have, Germany for instance, it won't make that much difference to the whole. Which, by the way, isn't to decry it. That argument that says we only have 1% of the total, so nothing we do makes a difference. That isn't a valid argument when you have a problem that is shared amongst many players. When the aggregate impact is high, but the individual ownership of any part of that impact is low. Everyone has to play their part. Okay, having segued onto that theme, let's explore it further. From your Monday video, that's the one where I talked about the Scientists for Extinction Rebellion group. The quote at the top of a tweet with the video of the activists: "We've looked at evidence from history. Non-violent civil resistance is the most powerful way to make change." Would be interested to hear your thoughts on this statement. I criticise that in the video because it's a huge example of the shallow performative nature of the arguments that they're making. This line originated with Roger Hallam in this context, who believed that Gandhi's movement in particular, but other non-violent resistance movements as well, showed the way that climate activists would be able to bring about major change, or in his words specifically, bring down the government. And it shows how self-motivated reasoning makes you a very bad student of history and pretty much anything else. I have some views on this because I was in the peace movement in the 1980s. During that time, I read extensively on Gandhi, along with some of the rest. And the point is, yes, non-violent resistance proved an immensely powerful tool if you were an oppressed people being ruled over by a minority power, and importantly a minority power that depended to some degree on having a reputation that they need to defend. So, not Hitler, not Stalin, but in that scenario, yes, you could have a community of people removing their consent from the rulers. A minority can't rule a majority without the majority's consent. Hence, Gandhi's symbolic law-breaking was to hit at symbols of British imperialist rule, such as the Crown monopoly on salt manufacture, as well as a boycott of British-made cloth, with village Indians making homespun cloth for civil resistors to wear, as well as those activists making their own salt. Those actions inconvenienced and, more importantly, challenged the authority of the Crown. Did so in a way that helped to build self-respect and self-reliance amongst the people of the community who wanted their freedom. Basically, they were claiming their freedom by starting to behave, at least in some strategic areas, as though they were already free. It's immensely powerful. Now, how do you get from that to people who are seen as relatively marginal by the mainstream of your society, creating nuisance and disruption to the ordinary citizens of your own society as they protest about a mutual, complex problem? Answer, it's not even remotely the same dynamic. In the history of non-violence movements, has there ever been one that worked in a way that Extinction Rebellion, following Roger Hallam's playbook, is currently trying to bring about? Not once, so far as I'm aware. Every successful non-violent mass movement has followed the model of the oppressed community demanding freedom or equal rights. When the scientist activists said that they'd looked at all of the evidence of history to see what creates change, if you were being actually scientific about that, you would break that down into what sort of change, to what lasting effect. I mean, wars and violent revolutions have created change, without question. The spreading of ideas, the liberating of innovation has created massive change. Now, in both of those cases, you can explain how the change was conceptualized before it happened, how it was going to create the change, which is hard to do in this case. How would Roger Hallam's change work if it went as well as he could possibly ever have hoped for? We don't know. There'll be a citizens' assembly to think about it. Really? I thought you said it was urgent. Shouldn't you have some idea what you would want to do if you're successful? So is it really that the evidence of history supports this, or is it just a lazy way to justify what people have decided that they want to do already, even in the face of actual evidence that it might be alienating people not gaining their support? Related question. Do you know how XR funds itself? Do any of the XR campaigners, protesters and organisers get a salary or expenses for actions? Extinction Rebellion makes it available on its website information about its sources of funding, which mostly come from donations, I think a few corporate donations, but mostly individuals. They also disclose, or at least they did, I haven't looked recently, how that was then spent. And they do have support for some people who are campaigning full-time, but I believe it's capped at a relatively modest amount. I have many criticisms of Extinction Rebellion, as you may have spotted. Unless there are streams that have not been declared, this seems to be pretty straight and to be commended. Compared to the corruption nightmare that is the US Black Lives Matter organisation, I think this is pretty benign. Hi Mallen, there is a lot of talk at the moment of large companies buying farmland to plant trees to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions. I know you've covered this before, but exactly how much carbon and over what timescale do trees have an effect, please? There's no way to answer this question without the phrase, it depends. Because not all forests are created equal. Not all land that they take up is created equal. Generally, I think that in the UK, it's a pretty bad idea to convert farmland, which we need to be productive, to convert to forest. Now, in principle, a tree, once it's fully grown, will absorb something in the region of 20 kilograms of CO2 per year. If a tree lived for 100 years, it would absorb about a ton of carbon dioxide. But a biodiversity-rich ancient woodland is going to have many more benefits than a relatively sterile plantation environment. So it comes down to the problem you think a piece of land can best be used to solve. Not all of the companies that are trying to get carbon credits are necessarily going to go that deeply into it, I suspect. In recognition of Easter, Passover and Ramadan, in his letter to the author of The Three Impostors, Voltaire stated that belief in a deity was needed because it holds a society together. This is the essay in which he wrote, if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Was he right? I don't think so. The presumption was that without the accountability of judgment and an afterlife, people would regress to the most bestial form of self-interested behaviour. That clearly doesn't happen. Societal norms seem to hold the basic fabric of human society relatively well without such supernatural glue. The related question is, does that nevertheless leave a God-shaped hole in our beings? And that sense of being lost that I talked about before, is that really to do with the loss of meaning that came with the absence of religion from people's lives? And the answer to that is probably no. Humans have shown that we are quite capable of finding meaning for ourselves based on human relationships, community benefit, individual success. However, they have to find it for themselves. In the past, you would go into the church, or even better, the cathedral, and you would be impressed by the sense of the thing that was bigger than you. The thing that turned your mind away from the trivia of the day to contemplate the bigger point of your existence. And that was kind of pushed onto you, whether you sought it out or not. It was built in to the rhythm of life. Once a week or more, usually on a Sunday, it was time to go into that quiet, profound space. Now, that was mostly human artifice. Churches and cathedrals were built in such a way to inspire the right sort of contemplation, the right sort of awe, and the sense of something bigger than you. A secular citizen doesn't have the same sense of ritual to produce that contemplation, so you have to find it for yourself. Some find it in nature, some find it, I guess, in meditation, others never find it. And that's when I think you might identify that gap that people are feeling. Ideally, you do create that space for yourself every now and then, just to contemplate the bigger picture. Which YouTubers do you currently watch who you think would be of interest to your audience? Blimey, I subscribe to about 200 channels. Quite a few of them would not be of interest because they're things like tips and techniques in running a YouTube channel and that sort of thing. Some of them are creators and strands of thinking that I want to monitor because I like to follow all of the emerging arguments from various points of view, but I wouldn't exactly recommend them because some of them I really don't like. So what does that leave? Ones that many of my audience will already know, should still be mentioned for those that are new or who got here through a different route. So trigonometry, great interviews, Potholer 54 for debunking videos, especially on climate. Medical related, which may become less of a thing in the near future than it has been for the last couple of years, let's hope. But my go-to creator there is ZDogMD. I know lots of people on here also watch Dr. John Campbell. He's got a great presence about him. But if I could only have one, ZDogMD would be my guy. And I've spoken here sometimes about being alt-centre. He blew my mind recently by referring to himself as alt-middle. So there you go. Maybe there's a movement growing. Anyway, commentators on the right, Ben Shapiro, Lauren Chen. Commentators on the left, David Pakman, Tom Hartman, Jesse Singal, Katie Herzog. I keep half an eye on dozens of different commentators from different perspectives. Scott Adams, Tim Pool, Jordan Peterson, Sabine Hossenfeld. I mean, really just all over the place. Obviously, Vlad Vexler, who I had on here a few weeks ago, very good value, growing quickly with his channel. I'm interested in people who have a perspective and then argue about current events or ideas from that perspective. Much more so in people that basically act as propaganda wings for a side, where every message is just the one designed to push the line. Are they the same thing? I don't think they are. It's the difference between an MP who is thoughtful and has interesting things to say that they've thought through themselves versus one who rehearses the party line. People are going to argue about who is who and so on and so on. We can all make that judgment for ourselves, but that's the sort of guiding star that I use in trying to identify the channels that I actually think are worth following. All right. If Elon Musk were successful in taking over Twitter, would it make it better or worse? Both. What makes it so engaging is its virality. What makes it so brutal and ugly is its virality. If you improve one of its problems, such as making it more tolerant of freedom of speech, you will inevitably make another part of it worse in order to achieve that. So the question doesn't become how good can you get it, but what sort of trade-offs are you willing to engage in order to get the thing that you most value about it. So the right-wingers who got thrown off because of flouting rules or whatever it was they were held rightly or wrongly to have done, they went to places that indulged their free speech priorities. They found them to be unsatisfying echo chambers. It's one of those trade-offs. From what I have seen, Elon Musk is not super clear about the dynamics of content moderation and the grey areas that live there. So I wouldn't presume that whatever actions he thinks he'd like to take would actually survive his discovery of the consequences of those actions. A group of health professionals had a letter published in The Lancet demanding that all members of Parliament should be briefed by the Chief Scientific Advisor, Patrick Vallance, about climate change. Since you don't agree with scientists protesting in white coats, do you agree that this move to make sure MPs understand the science would be a good thing? Well, my understanding is that has now been agreed and that presentation is going to take place. Will it be a good thing? The fact that this letter was a thing, to me, it was a testament to the complete lack of awareness amongst some people in, I guess, sort of left circles, how the MPs who are most likely to be climate skeptics view Patrick Vallance post-COVID. Presumably the intention here is that all lawmakers should be aware of basic scientific realities. Well, we just come from a bruising period where what was presented as scientific realities turned out to be highly questionable, specifically scary COVID graphs that were used to justify lockdowns. Now, you can come up with all the ifs and buts around those graphs, but since that has left degraded trust in the quality of scientific advice, going back to the exact same poisoned well, it's not really going to make any difference amongst those who have lost the trust. The issue is the presumption that the knowledge of the science leads inevitably to an indisputable conclusion relating to policy. The inability for experts to distinguish between the description of scientific findings and policy proposals is exactly why we were in this hole in the first place. Now look, I agree it would be good if MPs understood the basics of the science, understood reality. Of course it would. It would be better for the quality of decision making if they could distinguish between fact and fantasy, and they could distinguish between obvious fact and some of the contested areas and some of the areas where policies involve trade-offs. I'm thinking one presentation isn't going to get that job done. Now, imagine that the problem of building trust with these people was the problem you had to solve. And you had to start from the understanding that it's not because they're stupid or malevolent, but you should take the time to understand their point of view. How would that change the approach? Probably you wouldn't just be doing this presentation. All right, those are my thoughts. Add yours in the comments below. Thanks for all the questions, particularly to those from my Patreon supporters, without whom this channel could not exist. See you all for the news roundup on Friday. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.